Welcome to a special side episode of Glass Houses, a Billy Joel podcast. Michael's away, and I wanted to cover something timely, so I have some special guests with me today. We're taking a quick break from Billy Joel today to remember Brian Wilson, co-founder of the Beach Boys, and the creative force behind their sound and the majority of their most well-known songs. Born June 20th, 1942, he passed away this week on June 11th, 2025. Brian's widely been considered a genius for decades, thanks to his beautiful, memorable melodies, sophisticated vocal harmonies and arrangements, and creative uses of the recording studio as an instrument. I personally put Brian in a small group of rock and pop composers who wrote sophisticated and sometimes complex pieces that still sounded simple and accessible to everyday listeners. So to commemorate Brian's passing, I wanted to take a quick look at one of the Beach Boys' most enduring songs, God Only Knows. It was released on the album Pet Sounds, which itself is considered a landmark record in 1966. Spin magazine posted a recording of just the vocals for the last minute or so of the song. And listening to it, I remembered how much I love the song, and like we do with many of Billy's works, I wanted to break it down and see what I enjoyed so much about it. To do that, I'm joined today by two good friends. Frank Ghana is a Philadelphia guitarist, bass player, singer, and songwriter. We currently play together in the Michael Goldman Band, the classic rock cover band. And guitarist and videographer Colin Tabor is originally from Philly, but has been based out of New York City for decades. Colin's active with a few bands in the New York area, particularly in the Grateful Dead tribute band space. He plays with the Ripple All-Stars, Dead Reckoning, and the Jamborreetos, along with doing some studio work and producing videos. To prepare for this episode also, I listened to the podcast Strong Songs. Host Kirk Hamilton did an amazing analysis of God Only Knows back in 2020. And since his analysis is really deep, I thought this would be a nice stepping stone into that work. I had reached out to Kirk, and unfortunately he wasn't available in time to join us, but he said we can reference his episode as much as we want. So I'll talk a little more about it later, and I strongly suggest you all check out his podcast Strong Songs and this episode in particular. And with that, I can go off script and sound like a human being again. Guys, thanks for joining me, especially on short notice. We've all played together. We've all jammed some Beach Boys songs at Rial's in Northeast Philly on many a Sunday night. I thought you guys would be a great combination to bring on to go through this song. But before that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about like how we all discovered the Beach Boys and what made them stick. So going first, I remember hearing I Get Around first on the radio with my dad, and I remember how much it just jumped out to me. Listening to it now, a good 60 years out, it definitely sounds like an oldie, but I remember even in the 90s, the production of it sounded modern. It was just so energetic, and it really just caught you. And so at some point, I knew the song Wouldn't It Be Nice, and we were in the CD of the Month Club, one of those mail order ones, and I saw Pet Sounds, and it had Wouldn't It Be Nice. If I was in like 5th or 6th grade, I'm like, oh, let me get that one because it has this song I know. And I think it was a great introduction because I didn't know it was an important record. I just listened to it because it had this hit I knew. All those great arrangements, all those great melodies seeped into my subconscious without having the baggage of knowing that, oh man, this is important stuff and I should listen to it as important stuff. And that way, I kind of heard it the way it was heard when it came out. Here's another Beach Boys record. And oh my God, in retrospect, this is a landmark piece of 20th century music.
The Beach Boys, I was definitely aware of them, as I was as a youngster coming up into the music scene. My parents were big listeners of the late 60s music. And so this was among the music that I heard. What I remember is sort of the competition between the Beatles and the Beach Boys, reading about that, how Brian Wilson and some of the Beach Boys' work inspired the Beatles to do something like Sgt. Pepper. And then in turn, the Beach Boys were inspired by that to go further and further into, whether you want to call it chamber pop or you want to call it something else. It was revolutionary at the time, and maybe that fact is a little bit lost on today's listeners just because they didn't live through it or near it. I was 5 years old in 1968, 6 in 1969 when these records came out. I was really very young, but I was influenced by it a great deal.
I remember as a kid, kind of driving around in a family car. We'd always have Oldies 98 on Philly station, 98.1. They would always play them a lot. And I would always ask my parents, like, oh, who's that? And like, oh, that's the Beach Boys. And the first thing that stuck out with me is obviously the vocal melodies, the harmonies. It just sounded like otherworldly. They kind of had what I guess I would call a resurgence of pop culture in like the 90s. It seems like they were everywhere. So I remember we'd be sitting down watching Full House. The Beach Boys go on Full House. We're watching Home Improvement. They show up on Home Improvement. Wilson, Tim Allen's neighbor with the fence, turns out he's the lost brother who never was good enough to be in the band. So it seems like they just kept popping up throughout my childhood. I remember we watched The Wonder Years. The one episode, it ends with I Get Around playing. And, Wayne, his older brother, Fred Savage, is like they're like chasing him to get into his car. So they were always kind of there, and I was always kind of fascinated with them. But everything changed in, I believe, 1999. ABC ran like a mini series called An American Family, the Beach Boys, and it was like the whole story. The beginning, they kind of went into Brian Wilson, like the genius stuff, and then kind of like how he kind of had like, I don't know if you'd call it a meltdown or whatever after Pet Sounds and the Smile session. So it went into all that stuff. That's when I kind of took like a deep dive into like the whole Brian Wilson thing, the story. I kind of became obsessed with the story of like him, the songwriting, started taking piano lessons. I started like really getting involved in like the songs and like the structures and stuff. So pretty much ever since then, I would probably been around 7th, 8th grade. That's when I really got like deep into them. And it's been like that ever since.
They were on Full House a bunch of times too, right? Doesn't John Stamos have a connection with them anyway?
Yeah, I think Stamos actually was one of the producers in that movie I was telling that we're talking about on the. But to get back to the Home Improvement thing, it's funny because when they show up, Wilson's like, "These are my brothers, the Beach Boys," and then Tim Allen starts naming like, "Oh, that's my favorite song." He starts naming every song, but it's none of them that they sing. He's like, "A little GTO." They're like, "That's Jan and B." Like, it's funny.
Yeah,
And then he goes, "Well, the only other one I like is Little Deuce Coupe, and I know you didn't write that." It's funny.
They're a huge influence on everybody around them. They created the California sound. Interesting story. I guess in 1971, the Beach Boys were looking to sort of modernize their image a little bit. If you can imagine what modernization might have looked like in 1971, they were kind of on the outs, and the Grateful Dead actually invited them to perform with them at a concert. The two groups played some songs together on stage. Jerry was a huge fan of the Beach Boys, as everybody was in that day.
Let's talk about the song God Only Knows. It was one that stuck out to me a bit on Pet Sounds, although I was always partial to Here Today and I'm Waiting for the Day. Those were two that like just always jumped out a little more. You could mention Here Today or I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, and you had to be really talking to a Beach Boys fan for them to catch those, but you started noticing God Only Knows showing up maybe in a commercial or a movie and people knowing that one. This was recorded with the Wrecking Crew, famous LA session musicians. How long had the Beach Boys been working with the Wrecking Crew versus doing the instrumentation themselves or using other session musicians?
As far as I know, it was kind of a gradual process. Brian stopped touring, I'm going to say around all summer long when that came out. But I think around that time, maybe right after that, they stopped touring. That's pretty much when he did Summer Days and Summer Nights, and Today, Beach Boys Party, which is kind of to appease the record label, and then the Pet Sounds, obviously. He would kind of use them for some songs, from what I understand, and then other songs, he would just have just the band do, maybe at first. It went from that to like, he was just using them for every song. But even in Pet Sounds, there's stories that stuff like That's Not Me, he would do these intimate sessions when the Beach Boys came back from tour, which he would just have them play on it. So I think some of that is just the actual Beach Boys playing on it, maybe with one or two Wrecking Crew members. And there's other stuff that's just all Wrecking Crew straight through.
One of the interesting things I thought about Pet Sounds, something I keyed into years and years ago, the first thing I noticed was like, hey, wait, there's no drum set on this album. Like nobody's just playing a bass drum, hi-hat, and snare. It's all weirdly orchestrated. You know, my impression going by is that obviously the Wrecking Crew could play almost anything, but I don't think they were called on that often, at least for pop records, to get that orchestrated or that weird. You know, like when you think about Phil Spector stuff, it was still pretty straight ahead, right?
The LA studio scene was full of people that could do everything. The Wrecking Crew were on so many records. I mean, and the people that were in the Wrecking Crew are all legendary in their own right. You've got Glenn Campbell, who came out of that, went on to become a major star. There's other people like the drummer Hal Blaine who didn't, but they were all, They're all on so many hundreds and hundreds of records. There's a lot of nice interviews out there with some of those cats where you hear some of the stories.
There's a documentary that's been in my queue forever on Netflix too, just about the
I
wrecking
can
crew.
watch it too.
Yeah. And Pet Sounds is a great example of Brian's idiosyncratic arrangements that were so unique. A couple of years later, we'll start getting prog, and we'll start getting Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Jethro Tull. And yes, and as much as I love them, it's so obvious that they're playing at the height of their abilities, especially on their most complex work. And then something like Pet Sounds, it's not like they're doing fancy runs or anything, but it's just so meticulously put together.
There's some cool YouTube videos out there of like the audio of like those sessions. Songs will start off with Hal Blaine just playing like a drum beat, and Brian just stops it. He's like, Hal, no drums. Just come in on this beat or this, or
They're coming in and out, and the phrases that gets used a lot is chamber pop. And it's just that idea that like this could be classical music if they weren't played on rock instruments with pop lyrics. And God Only Knows, obviously, is a great example of it. It starts off, and I got this from that podcast, Strong Songs. One thing Kirk Hamilton was pointing out was how often you're hearing instruments doubled. So it's like it's a harpsichord and a piano and an accordion and something else, and they're blended together. So you don't realize it's two instruments combining to make a new, unique sound. And of course, this was at the advent of synthesizers, but they weren't using synthesizers at this point. So somebody had to like envision the sound they had in their head and then figure out what combination of acoustic instruments is going to produce that timbre. Did you ever hear, Frank, like you were saying, those videos, things on YouTube of like the sessions? Did you ever hear the ones where Brian will like keep stopping them and he'll be like, no, wait, the harpsichord has to come up, or this or that? Yeah.
It's hard for us to imagine in today's scenario where we're full of automation, we're producing everything with computers. We're able to adjust every mix element exactly the way we want in our own sweet time. In those days, running a mix was actually a performance. You'd have, 2 or 3 or 4 people at the mixing board, which was huge, 64 channels or whatever, maybe not in the Pet Sounds days, but eventually, you had to adjust the panning, the volumes, the relative volumes of the instruments in real time to get that mix. And that was basically carved, onto either a lacquer, an actual record, or onto a master tape. But either way, the mix itself is a performance.
We've talked about that a bit on this show when we have someone like Brad Lee or Larry Frank on, talking about working with Phil Ramone, how the rule was you always had to have your hand on the sliders on the board because you didn't know what was about to happen. And of course, Brian Wilson was really at the forefront of pushing the boundaries of that. So the song starts off pretty low key.
There's a chord progression that's really the same chord progression that we get at the end with the repeated 4-chord pattern.
The song starts off with an accordion. And like you said earlier, the accordion is probably dubbed with something else playing the same exact part. I'm not sure what it is. But then, yeah, I'm almost certain it's a French horn that plays on top of that for the whole intro.
And what always caught me at the beginning was the fact that the song starts off with the line, I may not always love you. Makes you think like maybe this is not going to be a love song. Like maybe this is one of those songs about somebody that's going to leave or they're having doubts. But, obviously just in that stanza that gets reconciled immediately, I may not always love you, but as long as there are stars above you, you never need to doubt it. The elements start seeping in little by little. Some congas come in, some more percussion. Carol Kay, a famous session bass player, she comes in with some strong lines.
It's an AABA form where the A is basically a verse and B is typically the bridge. That's where the sort of instrumental comes in and the ooze. And then it comes back to that same 12-bar melodic phrase. That is the genius of the song in terms of what makes it so amazing to everybody, in my opinion, and coverable, because in this 12-bar phrase, he's hitting 2 or 3 other key centers besides the main key that the song is in. Just for one chord. Then it goes back, then it comes to another chord. And this is maybe hard to communicate to people who are not versed in harmony exactly, but you'll feel it as sort of shifting and a lot of sort of ground being covered and going left and right. And the movement of it is just so beautiful. He's using the melody, and melody is a whole mysterious thing, in some ways. There's good notes, there's bad notes. We know a good melody when we hear it. We know a bad melody when we hear it. They can both be created with the same set of rules, like it's in this key, blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't explain anything about why it's great. That's the magic of music. But from the beginning, the very first chord in there where, I may not always love you, that line is in a different key than the intro was in, right? So immediately he's taken us out of it. And then he kind of brings us back in on Stars Above You. And then, you're going back out of it. And then there's that beautiful thing on, I'm sorry, I'm referring to the music as I sit here, but you'll never need to doubt it. That chord there, it's beautiful. An A minor that he rolls into, or there's a lot of ways to describe the chords. The other thing that happens in the song is that the bass line is alternate bass notes almost all the way through. It's just something you feel, but as a musician, I'm gonna say, oh look, there's an A minor chord, but he's actually playing a C in the bass or something like that. It's a part of the chord, but it's emphasizing a different part of the sound of the chord, if that makes sense. And it creates like this chromatic line on the bass that just sort of stitches things together in yet another way that is sort of under your level of consciousness. It's almost subconscious that you're not going to really hear it unless you listen for it, but it makes the parts weave together in just such a beautiful way.
When you listen to most pop music, whatever chord you are playing, for the most part, it's usually you're playing a C major, your root note is a C. You might arpeggiate that, you might do a step part, but Brian Wilson, this is to me a classic music trick, which is whatever note you're playing, he uses a totally different root note, and somehow it just like has this crazy cool effect. Billy Joel does it a lot too. That's to me why the song sounds so cool, and it like kind of tugs at your heartstrings a little. It's that root note clash with the chord, but it's like it's so melodic. It like fits so perfectly. And if you try to play the God only knows chords and just play like whatever note you're playing and play that root, it doesn't have the same depth at all. So it's such a huge part of the song, that little. I hear it a lot in classical music.
The thing I would mention here is a term that classical folks who know theory will know is voice leading. It's the way that chords are stitched together and the way that we move from one chord to another or one harmony to another. It's like the art of it is moving to the closest note. So if you're on a C, can you move to a B or a D rather than jumping to some other note that's not a neighboring tone? You're looking for all the neighboring tones, and whether you're playing guitar or piano, you are trying to make those shifts in such a way that it just sounds seamless and it sounds musical and melodic. And again, the melody is so strong in the song, but then also you have the counterpoint, which is something we'll come to when we talk about the ending as well. The counterpoint of the bass line. That's typically what you have in music. You're going to have the harmony, which is, a bunch of chords, but then you've got the melody on top and the bass on the bottom, and how they move against each other creates a lot of the interest that you hear as a listener. It's subconscious, a lot of it, but that's how it works.
My understanding of voice leading, to piggyback on what you guys are saying, is that major and minor chords are made up of 3 notes each, right? And they're usually played in like sequential order, right? C, E, G, right? But if you played G, E, C, it's still a C chord, but it's out of order. So if you're voice leading, you're going to play the chord with the notes out of order so that you don't make that giant leap from like, G all the way to C. You'll find another note in the C chord that's closer to G and you'll move to that. And that gives it more of a flow than that real obvious, oh my God, that guy clearly just changed a chord, right?
The way I'd illustrate it is almost like, okay, so you got your chord, it's got 3 notes like this. You want to move to another chord, like C to G. Well, C is down here and G is up here. But to get a good voice leading, you flip the chord around and then they go together better.
Frank, like you said, if you just sit there and play the chords down, it's not going to have nearly the same effect because you have to have those inversions and things like that. Now, I refer to this more towards, when you start putting extra notes like sevenths or 11th, 13th, whatever on a chord. It's like, when you start off as a kid, you get the box of 8 crayons. And then you get older and you get to 16. And then if you're really good, you get to 64 crayons, and it's still like the basic colors, but how many more shades do you have that you can work with? And how much more rich of a scene can you paint?
It's amazing that there's only 12 notes, and yet we have so much variety.
It reminds me of something I read a long time ago about Gil Evans, who collaborated a lot with Miles Davis in the 50s and I think into the early 60s. So they did like Birth of the Cool, then they did Sketches of Spain, Miles Ahead. A lot of it was the marriage of like bop, small combo jazz stuff, like that fast soloing stuff that you think of when you think of jazz. I think a lot of people do. But then it would be orchestrated or have this classical element or big band feel. There was an article just talking about like how he could get obsessed with one note. Like, where is the note that I'm looking for? I have this whole thing, but there's one note that's missing and I have to figure out like the missing piece of this puzzle. And it seems like that's, where Brian Wilson was often going too. Like, what's the exact note I need or with the exact effect to achieve the emotion that I'm trying to portray? So with that, we can get to the coda here, that last minute or so. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the bridge. That Strong Songs podcast, Kirk Hamilton gave a lot of airtime to this. And what he had to say about it unlocked another part of this song for me. And I'm going to summarize it really quickly. One, because you should all just go listen to his, and two, because I'm not going to know everything enough to say it conversationally, how it's on that like sort of barbershop quartet sounding piece. First of all, he breaks out the different harmonies and he recreates them using different instruments, synthesized. So you can hear that although they sound so close and so blended, there are a couple of different lines that you'll never hear unless you really, really listen closely to find them on their own, because the voices blend so well and the harmonies are so well constructed. But I love this idea that Brian changes keys in the middle of that bridge, or at least, keeps shifting out of the original key. And so when they say God only knows at the end, it's in a different key, but then the next line is back in the original key. If you listen, sometimes you'll hear like a guitar solo go through the entire verse except for like the last line or two, and then the vocal just picks up that last line or two and leads into the chorus, right? But they just stick to the same chords. In this case, if you've ever felt like that God only knows after the bridge, it feels like offhand, it just doesn't sound the same. It sounds breezy. It sounds not as centered as the other times that they say it, but then it anchors back to what you're familiar with when it gets to that next line. And it's because he's singing, I believe, the same melody, God only knows, but under a different chord. But it's set up so that he hits that different chord, and then on the next one, it shifts naturally back into the original key. Something else I saw online was talking about how Brian's songwriting and arrangements were so good. It was telling a story through just the music, not only the words. Like I said, it starts off with this deft, I may not always love you, and then it reconciles that no, I'm not being distant. I'm not trying to keep you at arm's length. I'm actually like showing my devotion to you. He does it again in the second verse. He keeps flipping it around. And so you get to this bridge and it's just such a walkabout. And it makes me think about like this idea of like this person like being so devoted and then, testing it. Like maybe they go out into the world, right? If you love someone, set them free. If it's true love, they'll come back to you, that sort of thing. And he does this musically because it goes so many different places tonally. But then at the end of this journey, it comes back and doubles down on the God only knows what I would be without you. To me, what a great way of storytelling through just the music. And when you marry it with the lyrics, even if you don't realize exactly what's happening, you get a sense of it. So with that in mind, let's get to the last 54 seconds or so, what we simpletons would just call a breakdown, where the instrumentation finally drops out a little.
Speaking of the same word, actually.
Yeah.
Go to the breakdown.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I'll say what I love about this is just how the instrumentation builds back up from just very minimal instrumentation and one voice, and these other voices keep coming in with these other parts, and they're in a round. Drums come back and dum. Just these like short rhythmic repeating patterns, and it doesn't get wall of sound like Phil Spector, but it really just layers like a tapestry.
Well, what happens at the end of the song is we end up on this short 4-bar phrase that just repeats and builds. As you said, it's like a tapestry. It's like a painting. It builds over time, and interestingly, we never actually hit the root of the song, like the key note in that sort of rolling ball of fun. It just keeps on rolling around, and we hear the God only knows line repeated multiple times. That's where it's like like a children's song from long ago, row, row, row your boat, except it's a lot cooler. We hear other elements come in. I think the snare drum is a good one, or whatever drum that is. Digga-da-bum, like you mentioned, that is like a part in the arrangement. Just this little drum beat, and it's very loud relative to kind of other things. I mean, it's quite prominent. It's very crafted, the whole way that it's put together. You hear the one phrase again and again against itself, and you realize, oh, okay, harmonically, this kind of works, in a magical way. Counterpoint, right? Counterpoint's another classical word, right? Counterpoint is when you have one line, like I was saying before, the bass and the melody are counterpoint, right? They're going to be moving together up and down, and sometimes they move apart and then they come together again, and you can hear that. But counterpoint is, when you have more than one thing going on at a time, which is what we enjoy. We enjoy that sort of immersive feeling that it brings.
Last year, I went down like a Bach hole, and I was listening to the Goldberg variations like almost every day, like the Glenn Gould version, just trying to like understand what was going on. And so my understanding of counterpoint became, maybe in simpler terms, it's sort of the magic of it is that it can be two melodies happening at once. So you could take either one of those lines and it'll sound like a melody. Basically, you have a third song on top of it. You could break it apart into 1 and 2, and the third's there. What we call a round, now, if I have this correct, in classical terms, they would call that a canon.
Yeah, I think that's right.
That slower God only knows, like that sort of triplet feel. It's like God only knows, and there's God only knows, right? I think what they're doing, and this is the beauty of Counterpoint, what Brian's doing here, is that it's the same melody, just about, but those notes have to match up because they're crossing at different times now, because he's doing the same melody at different lengths. So at any given point, that long held out note has to match the other notes that are going by.
That one part that you mentioned, God only knows, that's sort of a response, is the way I hear it. God only knows how I feel about you. You hear that, but then he does it again. So it sort of overlays, like, God only knows how I feel. And in the middle of that, the other one, it'll start again exactly the same. God only knows God only knows. And they go together, and then there's da 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 da, God only knows. To me, that's a response, sort of a musical response, like a conversation, like the way you have musical phrases, but it's the same theme, but stated slightly differently, transposed maybe. And that's a common device in counterpoint and sort of parts building like that.
There's some interesting Beach Boy lore on this song, the vocals, and especially the outro. First and foremost, if you're not that deep in the Beach Boys, you would assume it's Brian Wilson singing. Carl sings the song, not Brian. There's versions with Brian singing out there that he tried out, but on the album, it's Carl. The outro that we're talking about, the lore is that on the mono mix, it's Carl singing the God only knows what I be, the first part. And on the stereo mix, it's Brian singing it. For some reason, Carl went home for the day. That is like the Beach Boy lore. But either way, the outro we're talking about is Carl singing the God only knows what I'd be without. Once he hits the out, Bruce Johnson comes in, and Bruce Johnson replaced Brian on the road when Brian quit touring. He's been in the band ever since. He does that kind of echo repetition of that. And then Brian comes back in with that extended line, God only knows what I be, and goes falsetto without. And then it literally comes right back in with the beginning and it just overlaps. And it's such a cool effect. The lore about who's singing, that stuff's always interesting to me to like dive into that.
Yeah, and we love too those little things like the mono mix has a different take than the stereo mix, something like that.
Yeah.
I didn't realize they would do a separate take for mono versus stereo. I mean, I know Help Me Rhonda, that's like two completely different takes, right? The stereo or the single and the album, right?
Yeah, two totally different recordings.
Yeah.
Very different.
Yeah, was it like Revolution by the Beatles, same thing, like they had that electric version which was only the single.
Right, the faster version in a different key too. I mean, it's just, they mess around with it. Interesting story. There's a song by Bob Dylan called Forever Young, and it appears twice on the album that it came out on. He had pictured it as a fast song, and so the fast version, he was thinking about that all along, and one day the band cut just once. They cut it as a ballad. Producer was just dumbfounded, and he said everyone left the room with their jaws open, and we were kind of like, holy crap, this is great. And then Dylan was not planning to use that on the album, but the guy said, you really need to use this, and that's the version that everybody remembers. Sometimes the artist doesn't know, the public will tell you the truth.
Yeah, and of course that's something Neil Young did a bunch of times. Hey Hey My, and Tonight's the Night. He did that. He would do the same song acoustic at the beginning, electric at the end. Going back to like my little Bach excursion last year, like the Goldberg Variations starts and ends with the aria, and then I can't quite tie that back to God Only Knows, but we're putting Brian Wilson in some nice groups here, so we'll do it that way.
Just want to say we're going to give a shout out to Tony Asher, who did the lyrics for the album. He did a great job. Obviously, for this song that we're talking about, it's just a great song.
There's a reason that God Only Knows is one of the enduring Beach Boys classics. It's been covered by so many people. I mean, I can think right offhand of a couple great covers of it, but look around. It's really fun to hear the different versions that folks have done.
And with that in mind, we're going to end this episode with a version that Frank actually recorded, back in 2020?
Yeah, during the COVID quarantine. You can see how long my hair is in the video.
It was in your teen idol years, Frank. For all we were talking about, all the arrangements and the vocal harmonies, Frank did a fantastic solo version of it, just sitting at his piano at home. And I think that would be a great way to walk this out and, just kind of, say thank you to Brian Wilson for all the great music he's given us. This great music can be still listened to today. And even if we've heard it a million times, there's still something new to discover in them. You've devoted, so many episodes, obviously, to the genius of Billy Joel, and it's great to have the opportunity to look at another musical genius and celebrate the ways they were really able to expand the vocabulary of pop and rock music. So thank you, Frank and Colin. One more time, I really appreciate you guys jumping on.
No problem.
And, and we'll see you guys all soon.
Great. Have a nice
Thanks
day.
for having us. Appreciate it.